Here is an introduction to high-mass stellar evolution to accompany chapters 22 and 23 of the textbook Astronomy from Open Stax. So we covered the beginning stages of stellar evolution for low-mass stars. And if you have a star that's greater than 10 solar masses, it's going to follow that same initial sequence of burning and the hydrogen and helium burning in the core. But when you have this extra mass, the fusion can actually go beyond just making carbon. So specifically, the carbon can fuse to undergo nuclear reactions to make oxygen, neon, and magnesium. The oxygen, neon, and magnesium undergo various nuclear reactions to make elements around silicon and sulfur. And then a handful of nuclear reactions burn silicon and sulfur to make elements that are around iron. I'm not naming the specific nuclear reactions because it can get kind of complicated. There's usually a sequence of these that go on. And if we look at how they occur, we have what's shown here is basically a radial coordinate of our star. So it's in units of mass, but you get higher up in radius as you go up on this plot, and time proceeds as you go to the right. And so you have your carbon to oxygen, your oxygen, neon, magnesium to silicon and sulfur, and then your silicon makes what we call iron. So it's often said that the core is iron. This is a misnomer. It's a lot of elements around iron. And the reason that you make iron, we sort of covered in the Introduction to Stellar Nuclear Power lecture. You'll see that this is the sort of peak in nuclear binding energy, and you just can't get any more energy out of fusing iron nuclei, so it stops there. So the result near the end of the star's life, before it's going to explode, as we'll see in a moment, or maybe do something more exotic, is this so-called onion structure. And basically you have, the elements that you haven't burned that are left behind. You have hydrogen, and then helium, and then your carbon-oxygen layer, and then as you go in, you get to your sort of iron core. And again, these layers aren't specifically just these elements, these inner ones. It's a distribution of elements. And this is where a large fraction of elements that are lighter than iron are made. So you'll notice if you look at these elements that they're basically created by just adding together helium nuclei. So if you just kind of naively combined three helium nuclei, you'd make carbon. If you add one more, you'd make an isotope of oxygen. You keep going, you get your magnesium, neon, silicon, sulfur, and all the way to iron. And so these elements that are made here, these are the so-called alpha elements. And if you look at the abundance of elements in the solar system as a function of their mass number, so this is how many protons plus neutrons they have, you see a funny structure here for the lighter elements, and these peaks are the so-called alpha elements that are made in this advanced stellar burning. And the core material is this iron core is this peak that we see here. So you'll notice it's not exactly at one mass, you have a distribution of elements. So the iron in your blood, for instance, a lot of it was made in this process that we see here, burning of a massive star. So if we wanted to follow this on the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, it's going to be similar to what we talked about for the giant phases. So you have shell burning and core contraction, and anytime you have core contraction and shell burning, your envelope's gonna puff up, your radius is going to get larger, and you make a supergiant star. So it's just called a supergiant because it's even larger than a giant. So rather than something like 10 solar radii, you're talking about like 100 solar radii, a very large object. And the time scales for this advanced burning is pretty short. So just as an example, let's take results from calculations of two different stars. So this one started out as 15 solar masses. This one started out as 25. The main sequence lifetime for these is relatively short compared to the sun. So the sun's 10 billion years. These are more massive. These are just around 10 mega years. But as you go to, as you go to the higher elements here, you'll notice the helium is much shorter, as we showed before. It's something like 10% of the hydrogen burning time. But then the carbon is extremely short. So right, you're talking about thousands of years. The oxygen, neon, magnesium burning, this is years. Silicon burning, this very last phase where you're making your iron core, this is a matter of days. And so it proceeds extremely quickly. And just for fun, this is a cartoon that somebody made of a famous supernova that we'll talk about in a little bit called 1987A. But you can pause the video or go get the PDF from the website and actually map what 1987A has been doing over human history, which is kind of cool. So when we look at a given star, how do we know that it's about to go supernova, that it's about to do this core collapse and then explode? We don't, actually. So those burning phases are so fast that the structure of the star can't adjust in time to change the surface properties. So the surface doesn't really visibly change at all once you get to carbon burning. You looking at the surface, you have no idea that it's about to go supernova. Now, it may be possible to see a unique signature of neutrinos in the final hours before collapse. So those silicon burning can create a unique neutrino signature, and there's a search for these neutrinos, but we have not seen them yet. And candidate stars that these neutrinos are being searched for are shown here. So you're looking within a few thousand light years. You have a handful of stars that we believe could be close to going supernova. We don't know because you can't tell by looking at the surface, but these are ones where if you start to see a unique neutrino signature, then you know this thing's about to explode. And besides that being just really cool that you can do that, it would be interesting for astronomers in general because then they can swivel their telescopes over to look at this star as it's about to explode. Because otherwise what happens is there are telescopes that just regularly scan the night sky, and when they see an abrupt change in brightness, then they'll know a supernova is happening, and other telescopes will look. But those surveys happen periodically, so you can miss the beginning of the event. You pretty much always miss the beginning of the event, unless you're very lucky. So this could be a neat way to actually watch the beginning of the explosion for supernovae. So the actual core collapse supernova process itself is rather interesting. It'll create a lot of elements, as we'll talk about in a moment. What basically happens is you have your iron core. There's not enough pressure being generated to support the inward pull of gravity. So the core starts to collapse. So matter is falling inwards towards this core. At a certain point, you just cannot compress the matter anymore. So right 100 milliseconds or so later, you just have squeezed this central body as much as you can squeeze nuclear matter. And so there's a bounce, kind of like if you throw a bouncy ball on the ground, it'll compress and then it'll expand again. There's basically a bounce, and that just creates a large pressure wave that propagates outward. This outward propagating pressure wave can undergo it can generate some nuclear reactions, as we'll talk about in a moment, that can form some elements. Eventually, this outgoing shock wave will kind of stall. It just doesn't go any further. And then what revives the explosion is you have what's left behind in the center is this very hot compact object. It's the beginnings of a neutron star. And the way that it cools is by emitting neutrinos. And so this neutrino light bulb basically can heat up the surrounding elements and generate nucleosynthesis. And so when you have this explosion, this is one thing that can happen. I should mention that in principle, this neutron star can collapse to become a black hole. You can actually skip this whole process altogether and just implode straight to a black hole. And there's an even more exotic scenario for a very high mass star, one that starts out like at 100 solar masses. It can actually just totally disintegrate. Basically, the photons convert everything into matter and antimatter, and nothing is left behind. But what we're looking at here is kind of the more standard scenario of a massive star, exploding. So just briefly, what kind of element formation can we have? When this shock wave propagates outward from the collapsing core, you have your onion structure, the core collapses, shock wave propagates outward, and as it moves outward in radius, you can generate a whole bunch of nuclear reactions, and we can see how the isotopes that are existing in the star before the explosion are completely transformed. And so you can make a bunch of nickel, for instance. That nickel will eventually become iron that we can observe in the remnant of a core collapse supernova explosion. And you make other interesting elements like titanium-44, which we care about because it has a unique radioactive decay signature that we can use to learn something about the supernova explosion. Further out in the envelope of the star, so where the shock doesn't, it sort of reaches, it heats up the environment, but it doesn't drive those nuclear reactions directly. It's still hot enough that you can actually have photons. They photodisintegrate nuclei. So what happens is you have a nucleus, a photon hits it, and the way you can think about it is that basically provides energy to knock out neutrons and protons, and you can make different elements. So what will happen is you'll have heavy elements sitting around in the star from a previous generation of stellar nucleosynthesis. This envelope region is heated up. The photons then bust apart these nuclei to make lighter nuclei. And the reason you care about this is the only way to explain the existence of certain isotopes. So if we plot isotopes on the nuclear landscape, vertical direction is number of protons, horizontal is number of neutrons. Each box is a given isotope, and the gray ones don't undergo radioactive decay. There are these gray islands here separated from the main sort of island of, or valley of stability here. These gray islands can only be explained by this type of process. So, and one environment is in a core collapse supernova. And just for fun, those neutrinos, when they reheat the environment, they can also drive more nucleosynthesis. We don't exactly know how this all proceeds. We think that this probably makes elements in the region from roughly zinc to tin. And there's can be a complicated sequence of nuclear reactions that happen here. One possibility is it's mostly helium burning. Another is that it's mostly hydrogen burning. And that's an open question right now. So as you can see, the core collapse supernovae make a lot of stuff. So you have the elements that were made in massive star evolution. You have elements made from the shock-driven nucleosynthesis, some from the so-called P process, that was that photodisintegration process we talked about. You have elements from the neutrino-driven wind. Whole bunch of stuff is made, and if you take this to the periodic table that you're familiar with, then the yellow shaded regions, this indicates elements that are made in these exploding massive stars. So you'll recognize kind of the lighter elements that are made in the just massive star evolution, and then the ones that are a little bit heavier, these are then furthermore made in the explosion. And the way that this material is ejected into the universe is the way you'd think. It's just in the supernova explosion, the material is blown off. So what we're looking at on the right is a plot of the mass left behind kind of at the end stages of stellar evolution versus the initial mass. And in this diagram, the orange, this is the amount of mass that is thrown out into the universe from the supernova explosion. The gray, this is from stellar winds that we talked about in low mass stellar evolution, and all the other colors just mean the stuff wasn't ejected. So in terms of what's not ejected, what's left behind after the explosion, these are what we call the remnants. Or more commonly, you might just say a compact object. And we're being purposefully vague there because this compact object could be something very dense called a neutron star, or something of, in principle, infinite density known as a black hole. And we'll cover these more in the next lecture on Introduction to Stellar Remnants. The point that I just want to make here is that you don't, you won't necessarily produce a neutron star in every single stellar explosion. You might produce a black hole. And as far as the mapping between whether you produce a neutron star or a black hole, we don't really know. So the different bands here, these are different stellar models that are all, no reason to doubt any of them necessarily. The horizontal axis, this is the initial mass of a star. If you're green, you produce a neutron star. If you're black, you make a black hole. You don't even really explode, you just implode. So as you can see, in general, you make neutron stars for lighter, if your initial mass is relatively low. And in general, you make black holes for higher mass stars. But there's exceptions in between, and we don't really know where those are. It turns out to be kind of a complicated question related to stellar evolution. In higher regions, you may not make anything at all because you have this really exotic thing called a pair instability supernova, where it's so hot that materials sort of basically split into matter and antimatter is a way to think about it, and that annihilates and you leave behind nothing. And if all of this sounds like just sort of fanciful theorizing, there is observational evidence of these core collapse supernovae and the results of massive star evolution. And probably the most famous one is this one called 1987A that was observed in February of 1987. So there's all kinds of observational data from this object. So for instance, we have the optical light curve. So this is the amount of light produced as a function of time. Here we're just looking at the different spectral bands. So you have some in the visible, and you even have outside of the optical. So there's the light curve here just from energy released from the explosion, and this matches quite well with astrophysical model calculation predictions. There were even neutrinos seen produced from the explosion. So what you're looking at here is the number of neutrinos produced as a function of time. And in this fun plot, we have one neutrino detector in the vertical, on the upper half rather, and on the lower half we have another neutrino detector where you see this burst of neutrinos over time. And this surplus was one basically major validation of core collapse supernova theory. You needed to see these neutrinos if the theory was correct, and indeed they were seen. And as far as a remnant, for a long time there was not any evidence of a remnant left behind from 1987A, and it was kind of a deficiency in the theory because we really thought we should have seen one. And in the past few years there has been some somewhat indirect evidence, but evidence nonetheless, that there is a neutron star left behind from supernova 1987A. And that is it for this introduction to high mass stellar evolution for Astronomy 1000.